and free your mind. See what you can find when you leave it all behind. You'll free your mind. Free your mind. Free your mind.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the beginning of a fantastic journey that we're going to be on for this whole weekend. And it is a journey about creativity and the two of the most magnificent and creative people who have formed the world we lived in today, Gustav Mahler and Sigmund Freud. And they came together in July of 1910 when Freud spent most of the day analyzing Mahler, who had a million problems, as we'll hear over the next few days, and kind of psychoanalyzed him as they walked around Leiden in Holland. And from that, we derive the idea of this seminar to look at creativity, to explore what makes a fantastic set of ideas and a real breakthrough in both music and in the workings of the mind that we have. For the idea of the seminar, we are all grateful to Alan Fletcher, who came up with that last summer. Alan is, as you know, the CEO and president of the Aspen Music Festival. He has been with us now about a year and a half. He comes to us from the Carnegie Mellon. He was director of music there for a good number of years. He is a master and a doctorate from Juilliard. Went to Princeton with Michael P. Steinberg right there. And really is a gift to the city of Aspen. I think that Alan really has made an enormous difference. And I think of Alan... I kind of think of Alan as the Pope John the 23rd of Aspen. Like the Vatican II, just opening up the windows and letting all the arts groups in Aspen and all the intellectual groups in Aspen collaborate with him in a very open and wonderful, wonderful way. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for the idea of this seminar. The seminar is sponsored. We are very grateful to Barbara and John Lee. Raise your hands right there for the sponsorship. So in the next 2 or 3 days, if you run across the Lees, just do as I am going to do and just say thank you very much for doing that. It's a wonderful thing to do. So thanks. Sitting next to Alan is really a gift to all of us, James Conlon, who is the conductor and the musical director at Wienna. He is the new musical director at the LA Opera. And he has been in charge of the Cincinnati May Festival for years. James has been the subject of a 6-part PBS series on looking at the winners of the Van Cliburn piano competition. And he comes to us with an interpretation of Mahler 6 that all of us are going to hear on Sunday afternoon that should be terribly, terribly exciting. And James also has contributed enormously, not just to the musical wonders, not in the United States and in Europe, but also because he's had just a personal passion, which is to revive the music of Holocaust victims that have been composed in Holocaust, people who were eliminated. And it's a wonderful way, James, that we all appreciate to give these people an afterlife, and a beautiful afterlife at that. So thank you, James, for doing that. Michael Steinberg. And James came to Aspen first 39 years ago. So next year will be his 40th anniversary here in Aspen. Michael P. Steinberg comes to us from Brown University, where he is a professor both of music and a professor of history. He has written page after page of articles in his biography and great books that he's written, specializing in German Jewish history, specializing in music. He is also, besides professor in 2 different departments that I never heard of before, but it shows how talented he is. He is the director of the humanities program at Brown University. And while he is our Mahler scholar over the next 3 days, the subject he chose for his topic, the topic he chose for his humanities big festival last year was Sigmund Freud and Freud's emphasis and Freud's influence on all the arts. So our Mahler scholar is really an expert in Freud as well. So welcome, Michael, on that. And David Terman comes to us from Chicago, where he is the director of the Chicago Psychoanalysis Institute. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's kind of close. And a product, like Michael, of the University of Chicago. Joan Harris was very nice to propose David to us, and I talked to David, and he just seemed as wonderful as Joan said he was going to be. And while he is a practicing psychoanalyst, he started his practice in psychoanalysis in 1968, started his practice in psychiatry in 1963. He got his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago, his medical degree from the University of Chicago. And so while he is steeped in Freudian theory and practice, he also is a practicing musician who loves Mahler. So our Freudian guy loves Mahler. Our Mahler scholar has a big seminar on Freud, and we're all in this together, and it's going to be wonderful. So this is our panel. I'd like to start off our discussion on something grand, but something probably more important than any individual subject, which is the subject that we all deal with. And you people have contributed so much to us on, which is the subject of creativity. And what is creativity? What makes creativity? And how come certain cities at certain times, certain milieus, foster creativity and make an explosion of creativity? And that was certainly true of Vienna at the turn of the last century, where we had the great gifts of Freud and Mahler come forth on that. So James, why don't you start us out on that, and then everybody chime in.
Well, my first reaction is to say creativity with a small c. We all are creative, every one of us here. So I think we are understanding this question to be capital C, creative, when you're talking about creative artists, creative scientists. So that being said, what makes it possible in one day and age, and some of those are mysteries, some of them we only know by hindsight. There's no question that Europe, from the time of the Renaissance, at least until the First World War, because I think you have to consider that, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, a first demarcation in modern times where that creativity was seriously impacted by world events, and a second terrible, the Second World War, and the leading up to that was a second blow to that creativity. European creativity is one of the wonders of civilization, and specifically, I'm a musician, so I can only speak about that. The classical music tradition, created and invented by the Italians, and quickly taken by the Germans, who took it and ran with it, and created and had a situation where over centuries a tradition was passed on, and that tradition included every generation arguing with taking what its predecessors left them and arguing with it, and pushing the borders. And I think that Vienna, which my colleagues I'm sure will say a lot about, Vienna going up until the First World War was probably a high point in that development.
Mm-hmm. Alan, besides your other attributes, you're a composer. What do you see yourself, and you've won many prizes, you've given us great music yourself. What are the conditions that make you creative?
Oh, that's a left turn. I was ready to talk about cities.
I'd rather talk about you for a minute, and then we'll get to cities.
I'll talk about both then. I was going to say a certain concentration of wealth happens in almost every case that we look at. If you think of Florence in 1600, if you think of Vienna in 1900, if you think of Paris in the magic years just before the war, New York in the 50s with the New York School. And I don't want to say that I need a concentration of wealth to write music, but any composer needs a very special kind of patronage, because to write opera or large symphonic works presupposes a tremendous economic base to the musical community. I think all those cities also had a concentration of intellectual wealth, each for very specific reasons. And then each of them had a profoundly destabilizing element, politically or culturally. And I'm sure the other panelists will talk about that. But in Vienna, both the collapse of empire and the official anti-Semitism of the city were extremely destabilizing to the intellectual and cultural community in a way that mysteriously stimulates creativity as well.
It doesn't thwart creativity, it kind of stimulates it, that kind of disruption, that kind of unease, that kind of tension?
I think it's almost a requirement
really?
for the kind of ferment that we see in all of those cities and their cultural lives.
Michael, why don't you take it from there, because you're the historian here.
No, I think that's a very important point. I was going to start by saying that I feel such a sense of well-being here that I'm prepared to relinquish all my credibility on my first remark by saying that in my household there's a source of ancient wisdom that is cited virtually on a daily basis. And that is not a famous philosopher. It's someone called the 2,000-year-old man. I don't know if people here are familiar with him, but there's a moment in one of the interviews where he is asked, in your period of cave culture, what was the principal mode of transportation? And the answer is mostly fear. I think if we start talking about the engines of creativity, I'm not sure I would say fear, but I would certainly say necessity and a sense of real need that new forms of thinking and imagination are required. If we think of Fin de siècle Vienna and Freud and Mahler, I can't think of any two better examples. There is a sense of enormous necessity and almost desperation that really is the impetus for the unbelievable hard work that they're both doing. Neither of these figures produces easy material. They produce extraordinarily generous material. I find Mahler extraordinarily challenging, but also in a way very easy and consoling to listen to. Freud is an unbelievable writer, no matter how angry he makes you, no matter how much he himself destabilizes one's expectations. And I totally agree that it comes from destabilization and in a way creates more destabilization. But there's this drive to understand the world in a completely new way and a very generous way. So that you have, in both cases, a sense that the inner lives of the self, we always talk about this, I think, with both Mahler and Freud, that they're somehow about the innermost realities of the self, but they're at the same time about a sense of devotion to the outside world and a sense of responsibility to the outside world. And it's those, in a way, planetary systems that come together, this extraordinarily incomprehensible, impenetrable inner life that's all mine. I don't even know it myself, and I'm trying to figure out what it is. And then the world out there that is spinning out of control. The metaphors of spinning out of control are all over the literature, the poetry, the politics of this period, and is somehow moving those two things into some kind of coherent orbit that both these people are working on, in the sense that things are really, it's no picnic. There's beautiful art from Fin de siècle Vienna, but it's no picnic. It's a rough period.
Well, that leads nicely into David Terman, but are you saying, Michael, in essence, that you need inner turmoil, you need anger, you need people, unhappy for creativity? Because Alan Fletcher seems like a perfectly lovely guy to me, yet he writes fabulous music.
I'm a little uncomfortable thinking of it in that kind of mechanical relationship. In other words, because you're unhappy, you will be either, and I like very much the small c and the big C. I think that's extremely valid. So it's not so much that one can assume, it seems to me, that A causes B, but that without a sense of really working hard, of needing to work hard, of a struggle. I think one senses in both Mahler and Freud an enormous inner struggle to do that kind of work. And that doesn't come from a kind of walk in the garden.
Okay, we could go outside and have a scene from King Lear right now, but instead of doing that, let's turn to David and talk to us about that.
First, a disclaimer, and then I'll disclaim the disclaimer, but that is that Freud said that in front of creativity we have to lay down our arms. We can't explain it. So after having said that, I'll try to explain something about it. I think that I certainly agree with my fellow panelists. I think one of the elements in the creative process in these men was the tremendous idealization and ambition that they both had. Each of them idealized, Mahler idealized art and felt himself devoted to art and was often dismissive and arrogant toward those who didn't live up to the highest ideals of art. And Freud was enormously dedicated to science. Nothing was better to him than all the rationalist science of the 19th century. Add to this the fact that they were both Jewish, and I think that was important because they were Jewish coming into a culture in which they adopted and elaborated with a passion that others may have lacked. That part of the passion of belonging and enlarging that, belonging to and enlarging that culture. I think that was a very important element for both of them. And at the same time, as they desperately belonged and held the ideals of this culture and were ambitious to achieve in that culture, also ultimately became subversive of it, as did many of the artists of that time. So because Freud really deconstructed the prevailing culture of the positivist science that he came out of, and held as the highest value in his life. So I think, and Mahler, perhaps, and I'm not as qualified to speak about that, perhaps as James or Alan or Michael, that Mahler, in his way, may have been subversive to the forms that he adopted. I don't know if that's true, but certainly that was true of Freud. And so the larger phenomenon of the tremendous migration, there was not only the wealth, but the migration of these people into Vienna in the latter part of the 19th century, which stirred everything up and which stimulated a great deal. I mean, people came in from the country from all over. Both Freud and Mahler came from Moravia. You know, Freud came from Freiburg and Mahler from Iglau, although born in Callist, and they came to Vienna, as did hundreds of thousands of others, and that mix with the reaction, with the anti-Semitic reaction that followed that, I think was a very important element in all of that. It was a little bit like America, in a way. I mean, American creativity is partly a function of the vast numbers of people who've come to us. In Vienna, there were vast numbers who came into Vienna, but the difference being that they came in with a culture that was there, that they could work and whose traditions they could use. In America, we took time to create our own traditions.
I could just jump in with something for James, which is an essay into a comparison between two of the greatest symphonists, maybe the two great symphonists of the 20th century. First of all, James makes a great point about Mahler and his status as a 20th century composer, the other being Shostakovich, and both having a tremendous struggle for public identity based on their relation to the state. So Mahler being forced to convert to Catholicism in order to accept his position as director of the state opera, Shostakovich having tremendous formal conflicts about his own beliefs, and then each of them creating these tremendous symphonic structures through an entire lifetime, which are a result of that struggle and also a transcendence of it.
I want to pick up on the one idea before I answer that exactly, which you introduced, the idea of turmoil being very important for creativity and all. I agree. As an I guess I'm an artist, not creative. I recreate things that other people did. But I think I really doubt there are many artists who do not start out way down deep in their souls with some kind of terrible deficit, which is one of the motivating factors to embrace art and to live with it as a passion day and night all of your life. I mean, and I'm also thinking of there was. I think mourning is a very important issue here. I read an article, and you'll know it probably. I'm remembering from 30 years ago, George Pollack or something like the American psychiatric literature wrote, and I heard him speak. mourning and creativity, and that's a capital C, and that's mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, obviously. And he took several artists. I remember discussing Mozart, I remember discussing Michelangelo. In every case, showing that the full experience of mourning, if you go from beginning to end, the end point of that is always a reinvestment and a creativity. And it's true for all of us. There's loss, there's anger, there's disbelief, there's all of the emotions that need to be worked out. And those who fully mourn, the end of that is a reinvestment in life and creativity. And he tried to show how some of our greatest artists and greatest composers, writers, needed this. And then this provoked me to look into my own life, and I can clearly identify where mourning started for me as a child and how that continues to be a dynamic in everything I do. Back to Shostakovich and Mahler, I'd like to make 2 points on what you said. One is, yes, they both lived in conflict to some degree with their society, as do many artists. The conversion to Catholicism on the part of Mahler, it was, of course, a very common thing in Vienna. There are many other artists who did that, and some of them converted right back. I think that's a separate subject, but there's no question that Mahler said he felt like an outsider everywhere, and there was a Moravian in Vienna, and it was a Jew everywhere.
An Austrian in Germany, and a Jew everywhere.
And a Jew everywhere.
Right.
So there's no question. Talk about mourning, talk about childhood trauma. You'll know more than I do. Mahler is a great example of that.
Mahler is a super example of that.
Shostakovich lives oppressed by the Soviet system, creates 15 massive symphonies, and who was a great admirer of Mahler. So that here we have to see also that Shostakovich took the lead from Mahler. What needs to be, I think, pointed out is that Mahler, on the outside, was terribly successful. At one point, he was the potentate of classical music in Vienna.
He was the rock star of Vienna.
Yeah, he was. So that he himself enjoyed that. Shostakovich enjoyed it at certain moments, popularly and by reputation, but suffered his entire life because he was under the thumb of the Soviets. He not only wrote symphonies, of course, he wrote chamber music, he wrote operas, he wrote everything. Mahler specifically concentrated on 2 genres, the song which was then worked into the symphony, and then the symphony. And so he wants to express these universal big themes that he takes through a massive genre like that.
I certainly would agree that mourning is totally appropriate in trying to understand Mahler's work. If anybody was afflicted with mourning, it was Mahler. From those of you who may not know, that there were repeated childhood losses for Mahler. His siblings died. Numerous siblings died shortly after they were born, and a very favorite sibling of his, the one who was closest to him, Ernst, died when Mahler was 14 of a pericarditis. The Mahlers were a very fragile group, actually reacting to streptococcus, and this repeated loss one can see, and certainly in a lot of his work, like Kinder told, well, in most of his work, and his dealing with loss in various ways. So I think that nothing could be more true of a composer than Mahler. But Freud, that's not true. Freud, there are issues for Freud, but mourning and loss, I think, are not those issues. There are other issues for Freud, I think, but mourning and loss is not.
What are the issues for Freud?
I think the issues for Freud were more his need to feel and be, to see everything in terms of conflict. And I think that's part of the reason that he had the difficulties he did. Not only was he espousing a theory that people couldn't accept, but he did it in a way that made it less acceptable for them. And there are many instances of Freud's seeing himself in opposition, in mortal opposition to others, which I think in part was his psychology. His psychology, the construction of his psychology reflects conflict. It's a conflict theory of development. he was less in tune with the deeper issues of mourning and loss than Mahler. And in a sense, I think that Mahler expressed the mourning and the experience of mourning and loss much more than certainly Freud expressed something that I think we've been able to relate to much more, whereas Freud talked about a psychology of conflict, which we've had to add to in subsequent generations.
And the conflict in Freud is the id versus the ego versus the
the so-called
superego,
structural model.
and the conflict of him introducing the whole concept of infant sexuality, which put him on the outs of great society.
That and the concept of the unconscious, which again dethroned our sense that we consciously are in control of our thoughts and our.
David, tell the audience here, because it was very valuable, on your three narcissistic.
The three narcissistic
denials,
injuries, yes.
Injuries.
Freud said he inflicted the third narcissistic injury on mankind, the first being that of Galileo, who said that the earth was not the center of the universe, the second being Darwin, who said that we were not created by God uniquely, and the third was Freud's, who said that we are not in conscious control of our behavior and our thoughts.
That's a nice summary for human history on that. Before we turn to Michael, let me ask you one other question, and that follows up on James's point of the mourning and artistic creation. Isn't that Freudian theory? I mean, when he studied Michelangelo, when he studied the artists in the back, didn't he say that there was a transference, there was a sublimation of their aggression and put it into a artistic creation, that you needed that sublimation of aggression for creation? Is that a fair reading, David, or not?
You needed not just the sublimation of aggression, you need the sublimation of mostly more libidinal feelings, sexual feelings. And that, yes, that sublimation was a very important part of any creative process, that what stimulated, one of the things that stimulated the process, though we didn't know how that occurred, was the need to discharge sexuality and later aggression.
And that has something to do with the mourning that James was talking about, doesn't it? Getting off that?
Mourning is a slightly different process.
Okay. Michael?
I think one of the really important common denominators here, and also between the two figures, is this question of insider and outsider. When one is an insider, when one is an outsider, to what extent one, as an artist or thinker or original mind or scientist, to some extent really desires the status of the outsider. In other words, the resistance of being like everybody else, or being integrated into a society that is in a way less interesting than things one can think of oneself. And I think both Mahler and Freud fall into this. On the other hand, this enormous desire for integration or some kind of resolution. I would argue, and I'm sure there's disagreement on this, that in both cases, the real desire for integration and resolution of conflict is not as strong in either the case of Mahler and Freud as one would think, or one would perhaps like to think, by reading them or by listening to them. In other words, that the desire for conflict to come to an end is not so clear. Freud, after all, I mean, Freud set the original, and here I defer to the analyst here, but in his very early work in the studies on hysteria, Freud actually, with his partner, Breuer, talks about the measure of a successful analytic intervention, and it's a very chilling end of the book, where he says that the mark of a successful therapy is the conversion of hysterical misery into everyday unhappiness. In other words, unhappiness is the goal,
then you can have a good
and not
day,
the cause. And here I think, again, I'm an amateur here, but it seems to me that the American reception of this, certainly in the 1960s, put happiness as the way we're supposed to be, and this is not what is going on in this discourse. In other words, to use another bit of jargon, there's a reality principle that is not only emotional, but political and social and cultural and economic, that's out there, where in fact happiness is not at all even in question. And in Mahler, I think there's something very similar, and at the risk of putting too many things into this pot, the symphonic is a really key category here. The fact that Mahler sticks with such passion to symphonic form. Shostakovich is a wonderful partner in this discussion, that with the possible exception, I think we all have our exception here in the Mahler symphonies. In my view, it's the possible exception is number 2. Which I have a problem with. But with the possible exception, maybe my problem, but with the possible exception of number 2, no matter how much those works talk about the desire for integration, resolution, the end of conflict, none of them actually show the way.
You're talking about Mahler symphonies?
Mahler symphonies.
Okay.
And that, in my ear, has to do with this extraordinarily rigorous attachment to symphonic form. Which always keeps this drive to be analytical and a drive to, in fact, respect the reality principle of an extraordinarily complex world where, in fact, the claim that one has achieved resolution, conflict resolution, is in a way spurious because you can't be real. You can't see the world soberly with open eyes and make that kind of claim. And for that reason, I don't hear the Mahler symphonies as making that kind of claim.
Well, I would say you do have a problem about Mahler too. Maybe David can help.
Do you want to lie down for a minute, Michael?
but I'd like to observe, really in complete sync with that Mahler, having achieved the absolute pinnacle position in the entire classical music world, arguably, seemed to get no pleasure from it whatsoever. And talking about David's idealization, Mahler, I don't think pursued that kind of power and importance as an ideal, but it was more the composition itself.
Right.
So he lived for those few months that he had alone as a composer. And it's just paradoxical how little fulfillment he got out of success.
There's an interesting parallel there. I mean, the lack of satisfaction from success, because Freud too was always dissatisfied with the reception of his work, and I think did not see himself as fulfilled by the reception that his work had gotten. So in that sense, I think there's a similarity. I just wanted to comment on Michael's comment on Freud, that Freud indeed did, it was the phrase was replace neurotic suffering with everyday misery.
In German, though.
Of course.
At least it's not a happy smile.
It's not happy smile, but I think it highlights a very important and fundamental aspect of Freud's thought, in which he elaborated in Civilization and its Discontents, that there was a fundamental opposition between happiness, between fulfillment, and the requirements of civilization. This was Freud's central notion that there was a fundamental incompatibility. Whether or not that's true, or whether or not one agrees with that, that is certainly his central notion.
I want to react to everybody very quickly. I know and love the remark about the exchange of neurosis for everyday misery. I think the end point of that is very much as it is in Eastern philosophy. The point is clarity. At least to me, it seems to me that the point of the suffering is because you are in touch with the world around you, as opposed to just being in a cocoon of your own neurotic problems. And I do think that this is part of the point of the Mahler symphonies, because yes, it's born out of a tormented soul, but the magic of genius is that through his tormented soul, he actually makes universal claims and wants to engage the listener also with universal problems, challenges, the real world, the imagined world, the metaphysical world, and pack it all together. Now, Michael, about the Second Symphony. Almost every symphony of Mahler is a momentary response to a particular question that he poses metaphysically, and I think that the lack of satisfaction at the end of that is that none of these answers actually answer him, and probably don't answer us. I mean, to go quickly through it, I mean, conflict, the First Symphony, conflict, resolution, and triumph over discovering that the world isn't perfect. The resurrection it's not even a Christian resurrection, because there are no damned, and as it said, there are no damned in this, everybody is resurrected. But he leaves it immediately, moves on to the Third Symphony, which is his creation story, and again he comes up with God's eternal love, and then in the Fourth Symphony he shows us a child child's view of heaven, and then he leaves it. The 5th, 6th, and 7th symphonies have their own color, and the 6th is unique because, to my mind, it is the only one that ends clearly in a pessimistic, nihilistic manner. But I do agree with Michael that because it has a quote-unquote happy ending, it does not in all imply that everything is fine. It, in fact, exists in, like the Greek theater, through tearing us apart, taking us through tragedy, making us frightened, making us weep, making us do everything in order to have a catharsis. The catharsis of Mahler is never accomplished, and that's why with every symphony, and that goes on after the 6th, it goes right to the end, he has to start from nothing every time, and so it is never finished. I agree about the 1960s. I was a child then. Happiness, happiness, happiness. Well, I think one of our biggest cultural weaknesses, and one that with which we live into our peril, is our inability to deal with tragedy and our inability to deal with unpleasant facts, I think, and in music and in art and in certainly the need of popular culture, the idea that everything is entertainment. We who deal with classical music, it's not about, entertainment is too pallid a word. It's not just to distract people from their daily life and make them laugh. I mean, what do you do in a culture where today's young people, their great-grandparents or their great-parents were already addicted to the television, where there's canned laughter, where it tells you when to laugh. You can't go to a Mahler symphony, you can't go to hear Brahms, Beethoven, Mozart, and be told how to react. It presupposes...
Thank
you, Ludwig.
Thank you,
Ludwig. Now that's Ludwig. He's agreeing. He's agreeing. As a last point, and then I'll let you guys go at me. Mozart, I think, is the clearest example of the composer who, using the aesthetics of perfection and balance and beauty, takes us through the whole gamut of human emotions, puts the mirror out. Don Giovanni points into our inner soul. The Marriage of Figaro points to our inner soul. Così fan tutte points to our inner soul. The symphonies do, the religious works do. Everything does, and yet Mozart puts it back together again and says the universe is in harmony. That is the magic of Mozart. This is as far away from Mahler as you can get. And the last thing is just about Wagner. Insider, outsider. Wagner was an outsider who suffered or knew suffering because of it, but in fact loved that status, expresses it over and over and over again in every opera, and in fact, with his type of Wagnerian arrogance, feels superior to the entire world because he has a message that he knows no one else has. And he was an infamous human being, and insufferably arrogant, insufferably self-centered, egocentric, egomaniac, everything. The only problem was he was right. He was superior. He did have a vision that rocked the world, and not just the music world. He affected every other art and, to some degree, other disciplines. I'm finished, gents. You can fight me now. Beat me down.
I think the Mozart-Mahler kind of dialectic, right, is extraordinarily interesting, and I think one can go really far with it. I think that there are so many similarities. Also in the kinds of tensions they work with, despite the fact that Mozart mastered every genre and Mahler restricted himself largely to the symphonic and then, of course, the song literature. But both coming from the Austrian world, I mean, I now put my historian's hat on for a moment, what they both, I think, understood so keenly and then contributed to with such originality is the power of theater. And how an original mind can and perhaps must intervene in that world that is defined by theater. And the world as a theatrical world in the Austrian Empire, and this is the case in the 1780s, and it's still the case around 1900 when Mahler is working, theater is really at the core of political power. The world being represented as a theater is a world in which official power represents itself theatrically, whether it's literally on the stage or whether it's in architecture, whether it's in urban planning. Ultimately, it has a sacred foundation. In other words, you have God, and then you have the world as a representation of God, and the authority comes from God with representations on earth. And Mozart understood this with extraordinary clarity. So Don Giovanni is a very, very powerful challenge and a kind of disruption to the order of the world, which incorporates the theater in which he himself is working. In Mahler, there's this extraordinary split where Mahler works as the director of the Opera House, which is the court opera house. It's a branch of imperial power. Those of you who know Vienna know that the opera houses are right there within the complex of the royal palace. And yet his own creative work is done outside of the genre of opera. It's, in a way, at times very theatrical, but also very anti-theatrical. So it's, my own take on this is that the passion about the symphonic puts himself in an anti-theatrical position. That this is an analytical discourse, again, to confuse the genres a little bit. That the symphonic is a way of breaking through the official culture of controlled, total representation that he sees all around him, in which he's working in it. As the opera director, even though he's very subversive inside the opera house too, with avant-garde productions, and also trying to bring Salome to the Vienna Opera, he fails. There are stories on that side as well.
Well, and I think it's true, and this in no way argues with what James said. But although we think of Mozart as the sort of avatar of perfection and balance and harmony, that the reception history is that the word romantic was really first used in music to describe his works. And that, whereas Peter Schaeffer says it's too many notes, the real problem was that Mozart was considered very dark, and often, not in every case, but seemed to be presenting conflict and humanity to his audience in a way that Salieri and the others were not.
They were the entertainment industry, and Mozart turned it into something sublime. That's.
I'd like to take issue with one thing, though. I certainly agree with your analyses of Mozart and Mahler, but I would take issue that I think that Mahler is expressing a helplessness, a sadness, a difficulty in relation to the world that is there and is unresolved, except I think maybe in the eighth, which is I think I call the Symphony of Denial. But
why?
Because
I
think it's a grandiose statement following on the enormous the collapse of his life after his daughter has died, and he's diagnosed with heart disease, and he writes this enormous work that I think is pompous and grandiose, unlike
I'll be back.
Okay. We can disagree on that. But I also disagree with if America and if the world were so fixated on pleasure and easy answers, I don't think Mahler would be as popular as he is. Mahler is second to Beethoven in performance, or maybe first. He speaks to us, and I think he speaks to us precisely because of the experience that he's raising for us, which is the mourning, the despair, the difficulty in the face of the forces that we all have to deal with.
I'd like to shoot back by... I'm sorry. But just about entertainment, I wasn't talking about those of us, the converted, who are already fans of and lovers of classical music. I'm talking about the culture in general, and why it's so hard for us to reach a lot of people now in today's world.
Well, okay.
I don't want to bore everybody with my ideas about the Eighth Symphony, but I would definitely disagree about that.
Well, let's
hope you will.
May I?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think, first of all, there's a big danger in general about making too clear a link between the biography of artists and their actual art. Although Mahler is probably the most tempting, delicious example of who you can really... We wouldn't be here today if we weren't trying to do that. But I would like to plead that ultimately every artist, including every great artist, somehow or other has a distance and a sense of objectivity, or at least is striving for objectivity, to create a work of art that is separate and different from him or herself. And so I think it's always extremely dangerous to make too many links, because it may be that there's a tragedy and somebody writes a comedy at that time. There may be that man is perfectly happy. I mean, Rossini, the happiest man of all, right? The Barber of Seville, the Italian in Algiers, the Turk in Italy, basically stopped composing because of his depression. I mean, so you cannot make any. I think I'm always against ultimately analyzing the work on the basis of biographical facts. The Eighth Symphony, I'm going to leave that.
Well, you're right. I think that is a caution that one needs to make.
Yeah.
And certainly his most despairing work, in certain ways, Kindertotenlieder, was written at the best time of his life. Which I think, although I think that one could think about the sources of that in terms of his life experience, which would not be totally
of course,
misleading.
his siblings who had died.
Right. But I think you're right to say that this is simply an immediate reaction. I think is over-interpreting. Nonetheless, that's how it struck me.
Well, I'm one who loves the Eighth. I love all of them, but one of my closest musical friends really dislikes the Eighth because she says the first movement is like when you're body surfing. And a huge wave comes and slams you repeatedly against the pebbly floor of the ocean. The force of it is just so gigantic. It seems to say, this is so much bigger than you are. And that's overwhelming. Now, yeah. I still like it, and I like the body surfing too.
David, talk to us about what our interpretation of Mahler right here in Freudian terms. What is there about this conflict that James and Alan talk about that people find satisfying, and why is Mahler so enormously popular, admittedly among those who go to see classical and listen to classical music, but in the culture generally? Is there something in Freudian theory that can help us say that, oh my God, this is really what's going on in our subconscious, so that we can identify, even though we like to be happy, we like to have a happy face all the time and see the smiley face, that's not what's going on in our minds and our souls?
Well, I don't know about Freudian theory, but I think that it probably what is true of our experience of Mahler is true of our experience of tragedy. That we enjoy watching tragedy and experiencing tragedy because we can experience those feelings that resonates with something that we have to deal with, and yet we're not in the position of those who are in the tragedy. I think the same is true for Mahler, that we can experience the loss, the longing, the difficulty in being defeated by superior forces, and the helplessness that involves, and the beauty that may come from that. We can experience all that and yet not be that immediately. So I think.
Just here's another thing I'd like to defer both to James and Alan on this, but it seems to me that the actual physical and raw sound in the Mahler symphonies has something very modern and or contemporary about it. That there's something about the sound world that I think one can refer to Mahler's orchestra, Richard Strauss's orchestra, not yet Wagner's orchestra, and I don't mean this at all disrespectfully, as a huge industrial machine. It's a huge machine. I mean, if you look at just the kind of power on stage and the size and multiplicity of the instruments, there's an unbelievable sonic power, which at times gets reduced to incredible human, intimate tenderness, and then goes back to a machine that could kill you in a way if it comes at you in the wrong way, even without the hammer in the Sixth Symphony, which is on its own a kind of scary component in an orchestral sound world. So that somehow it's our world. I think when we hear Mahler, there's something in the rawness of the sound that, and again, I would say that some conductors try to censor. I mean, I think there are some performances of Mahler here. Again, I'm walking on ice here, so I'm happy to make mistakes and be told I'm making mistakes. But there's certainly some performances of Mahler where everything is beautiful all the time, and there are other performances where, in fact, it's this richness and, in fact, danger and rawness of the contemporary sound world that is really challenging and at times upsetting. and has something to do with why we respect this highly contrived aesthetic discourse as something that is real in a very raw way. Now, again, correct me if I'm totally out of bounds. But.
Terrific. I don't think you're going to hear unadorned beauty tomorrow. I mean, the sixth is not the piece to come to. I mean, the dimensions, the violence of the sixth, the power of this cataclysmic last movement, which inspires hope constantly to be beaten down by this hammer blow. It is Sisyphus who will, in the end, be underneath that boulder, and I think that's an important point. About the sound language, one of the extraordinary, and maybe Alan will want to comment on this, the extraordinary characteristics of Mahler is that he seemed to have found his own voice and sound world immediately. The first and most significant work, which is called Das klagende Lied, which can be translated as the Song of Accusation or the Song of Lamentation, 18 years old, probably working out his brother's death, Ernst, the Cain and Abel story told again. The sound is already Mahler, some influences of Wagner, but it's clearly his, and he created a sound which was his and for which the 20th century was enriched. And incidentally, one of my great interests in presenting those many composers who were suppressed by the Nazis, not just those who died in concentration camps, but the entire generation, this is the real progeny of Mahler. We have had so that in restoring this music to the canon of our classical music repertory, it is not just to undo an injustice, it is to restore what we don't know about the 20th century. Were you to have suppressed Schumann, Mendelssohn, Brahms, you would not properly understand the gigantic personality of Beethoven, because Beethoven left a shadow over the entire first part of the 19th century, and it is to be reflected in the further development of that. I believe Mahler stands that way in the 20th century, and that we still don't know how to appreciate that, because the direct progeny, the Zemlinskys, the Ullmanns, were snuffed out, and those were the voices that were bringing on that vocabulary. Last thing about, talking about entertainment, catharsis, why do we enjoy tragedy? I think, certainly I know it as an artist, is that as, living my turbulent artistic soul day and night all the time from when I was a teenager. My wife is laughing over there. The fact that I could listen to this music, play this music, conduct this music, anything that I felt that I had suffered, the slings and arrows of fortune, I felt he had known before me and had put on this big canvas, and that I could experience it. And through the cathartic character of that, I continue to renew my own hope and belief in life, because I saw that he had it all, and that he kept creating in that. And I've heard, I don't know if it's true, that the eagles have a way of diving down to the ground, and that they are practicing their death. That this is a sort of preparation for them. That's what catharsis is. And to me, Mahler, totally clarity about death, at the same time, a total affirmation of the importance of life, and affirmation of that life through the actual act of creation with a capital C. Alan, was I wrong?
No, and I'll just go back to Michael's point, which I think is crucially important. Schoenberg and his disciples depended on Mahler, both for his help and patronage, but also his example. And what they saw was a tremendous transparency of texture and color. So they were much less impressed by these few gigantic, titanic moments in Mahler, as with the predominance of an extremely beautiful, almost chamber music use of the large orchestra. At war with that is the fact that Mahler, here's a stretch, Mahler in a kind of Oedipal gesture took the works of Beethoven and reorchestrated them. So he presented Beethoven in his own orchestral palette. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I don't do any of those works, but
no one does any longer.
It may be edible.
I think Bernstein experimented a couple of times using the Mahler orchestrations of Beethoven, but no one else really has picked them up.
I'm unaware. Did Mahler orchestrate?
He reorchestrated many things.
Okay. I didn't realize that he reorchestrated many.
He did.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Now's a good time to open it up for questions. We have the mics on both sides, and feel free to ask our wonderful panel and just go up there on questions that may arise on Freud, Mahler, your turmoils, whatever. And while people are taking the mic, let me just say that this wonderful program that Alan suggested is part of a series of arts and ideas that started in January with young playwrights. We had last month, we had a wonderful 2-day panel on cartoons and the power of cartoons in life. We have this next month. At the end of August, we're going to have a wonderful series on TV, the influence of television. We're looking at the Cosby Show, Mary Tyler Moore Show, and Grey's Anatomy with the director, with producers, with some actors from those 3 shows. And then in September, the 3rd week of September, Carol and I are going to do a Shakespeare and Jane Austen called Woo Is Me, about young love, and open for everybody who has had experienced young love or wish they had. And we're going to be looking at Romeo and Juliet and Sense and Sensibility. And in October, we might do something on eating right at the community of the table, about the culinary arts. And in December, we're going to end the year in the Arts and Ideas series with a real bang-up on Florence, the birthplace of the modern world. And we are going to look at all the tremendous innovation that Florence gave us the first week. And that will be like the 4th of July, Christmas, and everything all combined. It'll be sensational. Please start us off.
I wanted to come back to Mr. Collins' remark about Mahler and ask him if he could explicate a short remark just a bit. I think I understand why Freud, or any scientist, strives to solve certain puzzles and can be unhappy with results if he thinks it's incomplete. Nobody's come up with a grand unified theory yet, and so forth. You said that Mahler remained unhappy with his works, that he was never satisfied with what he had done. Could you explain that a bit more? And I took it that you didn't mean he was unhappy with the public's reception. I took it that you meant he thought there was something more he could do, or there was something about his pieces that he thought he could make better, or something like that. And if that's what you meant, could you explicate that?
Yeah, I will. First of all, I'm actually not sure I said that. But I will say the following. No, in fact, I think in many cases he was, in the great picture, he was satisfied. He was, however, like any of the rest of us, he kept picking away at them when he could. When he repeated pieces, they were constantly changes, but they were not changes of essence, they were changes of details. This orchestration, he took out a chord, he put it in another instrument. I would not stand by the statement that I apparently made, if I made it. I would say he was, the dissatisfaction that he had was far more personal, and it wasn't about the product. He was deeply unhappy and felt humiliated to some degree that he had to spend his life with his day job, which happened to be being the greatest conductor in the world at the time. And I'm always tempted to say I feel extremely lucky to be able to do what I do, because that's my favorite thing to do. He considered it a burden, just as Alexander Zemlinsky considered it a burden, because it basically interrupted his symphonic life. 10 months a year, he had to run an opera house. I love running opera houses. It's one of my favorite things to do. And he was dissatisfied and unhappy about that all of his life. And I'm only going to say that unhappy with his results of each symphony? No. But he did not find that his answer of the resurrection was the real answer. So he put another question to him in the Third Symphony, and he dealt with that. And on and on. He was never satisfied with the answer. And that just makes him a great metaphysical mind. He just kept asking the same questions over and over again.
Anything else on Mahler's happiness, David?
I just wanted to add, Jim, I think that he certainly suffered frequent poor receptions of his work.
And who hasn't?
Right. No, and there was an interesting story that that concerned Max Graf. Max Graf was a music critic in Vienna, and he also happened to be part of Freud's circle, part of the initial Wednesday night circle that Freud drew around him in about 1902. And Graf In fact, Graf was the father of a very famous case in psychoanalytic literature called Little Hans. And Little Hans had the fortune or misfortune of being analyzed by his father, who was part of the circle of Freud. Actually, it was Freud doing that. But anyway, in any event, that little intersection notwithstanding, Graf, who was a music critic and an eminent one, had liked Mahler's, appreciated Mahler's early works, the first, the second, but he reviewed the fourth in a very negative way. He thought the fourth was very childish, and he felt he had to go and explain this to Mahler, with whom he had something of a relationship. And so they talked, and he was apologetic for his view, but he just didn't see that the fourth was anything other than, well, not anything other, but that it was very childish. And Mahler just totally dismissed him. He said that, you don't understand. This is ridiculous. He says, but I did understand your earlier works. He says, you've understood nothing, and dismissed him. His response to the negative criticism, which he often had to face, not always, but often, was to assert his own artistic vision, and he said many times, and I think he believed, that in 100 years, indeed, that people would appreciate what he'd done, and of course he was right.
Yeah. Alan or Michael, anything on that? Okay, good. Go on.
Reading a little bit about Mahler's work, his work kind of faded out after his death, and then, of course, during the Nazi era, it was suppressed. But why didn't it thrive here in the United States until Bruno Walter and Leonard Bernstein really became pushers of Mahler's music?
As a conductor, I'm going to say, first of all, the music didn't die out. The environment in which it could become known died out. The anti-Semitism played an enormous role. The fact is that Mahler's music had not really taken root except in Holland, through the Concertgebouw, through Mengelberg. That was the only country. The real heroes in this story are the Dutch. Having spent 8 years there, I've come to acknowledge that. Then he had his disciples, and those disciples were Bruno Walter, Otto Klemperer were the two big ones, Alexander Zemlinsky. Well, they all immigrated, and Klemperer and Walter were to become the two champions. The other big champion, who is not mentioned as often as he should be, is Dmitri Metropolis. They were the champions. And then it was through the incredible charismatic and personal identification of Leonard Bernstein that it became, quote unquote, popular in our country. I think some of that also has to do with the fact that the time was ripe. Just as Mahler said, my time will come. What is extraordinary to me about Mahler is that I believe, you're going to tell me now if this is true, I've heard it said, that Freud said, that neurotics and artists are somehow able to intuit the future, just like animals know when there's an earthquake coming. That Mahler intuited the 20th century, but he presented it only in the first decade. He seemed to see what was coming, but presented it to people who hadn't seen it and wouldn't see it themselves. We've seen the 20th century, and I think this is part of the reason for the enormous importance and popularity of Mahler today, is because we see it as the music of our time. I still have colleagues, musicologists, people who are great connoisseurs of classical music in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s, who still think it's a mode, that it's going to go away, that it's a fashion. The older generation had a lot of problems with this. I think after a certain point, with those champions, because it's the music of our time. The last place to come to Mahler, Vienna, and that's thanks to Bernstein. He brought it back to Vienna.
You know, I have a funny instinct, which I know is counter to fact, and yet I can't stop myself from feeling that Strauss was a 19th century composer, even though he lived through almost half of the 20th century, and Mahler is absolutely a 20th century composer, even though he only lived a tiny part of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you something, especially you, Alan, on this, but Michael as well, and James and David, and that is when somebody like Mahler doesn't get performed because of anti-Semitism, because he goes out of fashion for a while, is that disturbing to you in the sense that you can have great artists that are kind of in recession at the time, unknown at the time, and are we living in a world where there are great artists that you guys don't perform because we don't know they're great, and they're in 50 years from now we're going to slap our foreheads and say, oh my God, why didn't at the Aspen Music Festival you schedule some of these. We know now that they're fantastic, but they were kind of hidden for a while. Does that happen?
Don't even start me.
Yeah. Tell us about it.
Subject.
Well, that's a whole weekend right there.
Okay, go on.
And
Just give us the Reader's Digest version.
I don't want to get on my own personal rant about difficult repertoire and about the challenge of bringing, even to an audience full of goodwill, of bringing repertoire that is difficult, big, that they don't know to them, and the amount of personal advocacy that takes. I think there's a mid-century American symphonic tradition, which is right now almost completely submerged, and it's tremendous repertoire. I'm not going to say it's equal to Mahler, but there are 4 or 5 tremendous stars of the American symphony in the late 40s, 50s, early 60s, and this music is almost completely gone right now. But I think if we in Aspen, for instance, did a reclamation project similar to what Jimmy does with Schulhoff and Ullmann, to reclaim that repertoire, that it could be reestablished.
Mm-hmm. Good.
No, I agree, and that's the whole purpose of my Recovered Voices program. And I also want to say what you say about composers is very true. It also applies to performing artists. Those who may necessarily be in the spotlight are not the most interesting ones, and very often it is the contrary.
Mm-hmm. Right. And to affirm what you said, I don't know if Freud said it, but certainly analysts recognize the artist is always ahead of the scientist and the analyst in understanding the nature of psychological shifts and new psychologies. The artist is always ahead of them. So by definition, almost, it would require that we not be able to pay attention to anyone who's truly creative and ahead of us, because we can't relate yet to what they're able to understand and see.
Interesting. Please.
Well, I'd like to make a comment about the artist and happiness, and then perhaps you'll respond to it. I agree that the artist is unhappy in that he is driven by his underlying emotional issues, and out of those issues, I believe that the artist creates whatever it is he has to create. So he is miserable. But on the other hand, I think the happiness is a very important part, because the artist is seeking happiness. I think that through his art, or her art, he's seeking to resolve those emotional issues. And fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, they never do. Beethoven raged against authority all of his life. I think in the Fifth Symphony, he achieved the triumph, but he went right back to being unhappy and miserable and raging against authority. In his Ninth Symphony, he achieved the union and the love and the universal sense of mankind, and then he went right back to being the irascible human being that he was. And Mahler, struggling with his losses and with his grief all of his life, in his Fifth Symphony, I think he achieved the happiness, the resolution, and the ultimate affirmation of life that he was seeking, but he went right back to being miserable. It's interesting, I think the Fifth Symphony the 5 movements correspond, I think, to the 5 stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's death and dying, and as she described the mourning process.
It's an very interesting point. Thank you for bringing it up. How much of the artist's misery is ameliorated by the attempt to get out of that misery through creation, and then fall back into their set position of being miserable?
I think we have to be a little careful here too. I would echo James' caution in this, because though conflict and whatever unresolved psychological issues certainly color an artist's work, still the creativity is somehow somewhat separate from it. The particular nature of the work may have the flavor of the conflict or the difficulty, but the creativity itself in relation to that is, I think, something separate and not reducible simply to the problems that the artist is manifesting in the work. So I think we have to separate those issues of the problems versus the creativity. I think the creativity would be there and would need to be expressed whether or not there were specific problems.
But still, David, don't you find it interesting that Freud's whole theory is, as you say, on this subconscious in constant conflict?
Yes.
And you and James and Alan and Michael have told us that that's just Mahler's symphonies are that, in constant conflict and trying to resolve that. And it seems to me we have a musical interpretation of what Freud's theory of how the mind works is going on. I understand it's too simple, but
well,
come on,
I would actually.
we're
I would
here
differ,
on a panel.
I would actually differ with that somewhat.
Okay,
I wouldn't say that Mahler's is a symphony of conflict. I think it's more an expression of grief and loss and feeling overwhelmed. I think it's less the kind of, really, in fact, the kind of conflict that Freud was talking about than the kind of trauma that many of us later on have talked about. So that I see it as an expression of trauma and grief and not conflict.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
I was just going to say quickly, it does take an awe-inspiring effort to achieve creative work, and certainly on the scope of Mahler. Mm-hmm. And so the madness, if you will, or the unbalance that goes into it had better be countervailed by a tremendous amount of emotional and intellectual health in order to get work out of it. I think maybe in the next few days, those of you who are going to take part in the seminar will be looking at Mahler's own reticence about consulting Freud, or many people who are creative artists, their reticence because they don't want to be fixed. And then you look at the example of Schumann, where it just got to be too much, and he could not go on with creative work, or with Rossini, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, and then James. Michael had something to say.
No, I think we may have an interesting disagreement, which I look forward to exploring over the next couple of days, and that is, I have to say, I'm uncomfortable with the category of expression in science or among artists, for that matter. In other words, I understand the idea of expression as something that comes out that is already there, and it's expressed, and I think of these works and the motivation for their enormous scope and difficulty as a function of discovery, of exploration of something that is always new, that is never already there. That is not to say that emotional states and emotional analogies may exist, although I also find myself wary of the biographical assumptions. But that the impression one gets at the beginning of a Mahler symphony, and as one listens over the course of an hour or an hour and a half, is that it's pardon the cliche, a real voyage of discovery. And that what happens at the beginning is really a beginning. And that at least the impression of the listener, without necessarily knowing, without ever being able to know the motivations, or in many cases not being interested in the motivations for the creation of the work, is that there's something radically new and being discovered that has to do with a kind of recreated relationship between self and world, where both of these things are moving variables. In other words, both the self that is at stake in this work and the world or the universe. That's Mahler's great comment to Sibelius. The symphony has to be about the entire world. That there's something happening there that was not there before. And in a way, in performing it, it seems that it's always happening for the first time. In a way, that's the difference between a performance genre and a work that does not depend on performance for its existence. That it always happens again from the beginning, it's very exciting.
It's a very interesting point, and I guess when I sit here, I think of great Shakespeare artistic creations. And while we see Hamlet or Macbeth for the first time, we don't know what's coming. What is always startling to me, who have seen it a few times, is that when you listen to Macbeth, he doesn't know exactly what he's going to say. And in great speeches of Macbeth, and Hamlet is the clearest, and King Lear, they start out saying something, and then they find, by God, that they're doing something else that they didn't think they were doing. And it's not that they're expressing what they're thinking, but as they're going along, it's coming out, and they surprise themselves.
The more we think we know these works, the harder it is.
Yeah, but you can see that in many times. Right, I mean, Macbeth's speech, you'll say there are three big factors, and then he says six because he forgot about the three because he keeps thinking about it, and others pop in. So he doesn't know what he's going to say. And that's what's so startling about that.
James, I'd like to pass on that Shakespearean model. I believe that materials of art are the materials of art are the materials of art, like Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah.
The
First time Coolidge has been talked about in a Freud Mahler symphony, I'll tell you that.
almost contemporary. Shakespeare, we know less about the human being Shakespeare than probably any other transcendent artist. We're not even sure, people even claim he wasn't William Shakespeare.
James, we have a handful with Mahler and Freud.
There
Let's
you are.
stay there.
But,
okay?
but the point that I would like to pounce on that, because that is my point, that biography is fascinating. Yes, it's stimulating, but it is ultimately always about the work of art and the materials of that art.
Gotcha.
And therefore, and as related to our own suffering, torments, inner selves, every one of us in this room have all those sufferings in one color or another. We would all be capable of writing the Beethoven Fifth or the Mahler Fifth if we were creative geniuses and we had mastered the materials of art. Right. I can conduct a Mahler symphony. I've maybe done 300 performances of Mahler symphonies all my life. I cannot write a single bar that would sound like Mahler. Incapable. It's because I do not have that creative gift. Every one of us could do something if we were in possession of the materials of art, and of course we're not. So it's ultimately always about those materials, the mastery of those materials, and the ability to put those materials in new, interesting, different ways.
Please.
Okay, I'll bite. What problem can you possibly have with the second? And I'd also like to know, whether any of the other members of the panel have any problem with the second, other than the desire to hear the last movement every night before you go to sleep.
I think you're on your own.
I'm sorry.
Well, I love the eighth.
Will you talk to her afterwards about the second, Michael?
No.
And
The short answer is I don't believe it.
Okay.
You don't believe
I
what,
don't
the
believe
message?
the Mahler second. I don't believe it.
Okay, that's the simple answer.
But we can talk about it.
Come up to the stage afterwards, please.
Since we have a psychiatrist on the panel, I feel okay about asking this question, but how do you think mental illness plays into all of this and the current day use of psychopharmaceutical drugs, and a lot of artists not wanting to take that because they feel it takes away from their creativity? How does that play into these past artists, and would they, if they were medicated, do you think they would have been able to produce what they produced?
They would.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Were they medicated? Well,
No, what was the first part? I didn't.
Just about a lot of artists who don't
want to take medicine?
Yeah, decide not to take medicine. And how does mental illness play into these creative geniuses that you're talking about?
Well, for the second part, I would defer to James Conlon. That is that there may be in the sense that the creativity is separate. And those who have those capacities have those capacities, and that neurotic suffering and even psychotic suffering is common amongst all of us. But again, some of that probably stimulates the creative effort. I'm sure that's true. I think it's a very individual matter whether a person would be inhibited in their creativity from taking drugs or not. Sometimes, for some people, it might help them, as does treatment. Many creative artists who come into psychological treatment without drugs do fear that they will lose their creativity. And our experience seems to be they don't. That the neurotic process is interfered with their creative capacities. There's enough conflict left to generate whatever it is, but that people who are overwhelmingly crippled by or severely crippled by neurotic suffering have a harder time creating.
So they don't have to get over their neuroses I mean, if they get over their neuroses or the psychoses, they still can be creative, you're saying?
Well, who gets over them? I mean, that's right.
I thought you were here to help us, David.
Right.
It's like dermatology.
I thought it was called, I thought it was called the curing.
We do what we can.
I would just offer one unscientific comment on that. I've known a lot of crazy artists. I've never known one who would not benefit from medical intervention if they needed it. And who would not have saved Schumann if they could have?
Yeah.
And there's a very famous story about an intervention for Rachmaninoff, which really enabled him to continue his work.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Second,
Really?
second concerto.
What was that, psychoanalysis, or was that drugs, or?
No, it wasn't drugs,
It
probably.
was drugs.
Drugs?
It was
No,
hypnosis. It was hypnosis.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What year, do you know?
Before the second concerto.
While writing the second
Before the second
concerto.
concerto?
And look what came out.
I didn't, wow, I didn't know that.
Okay, please.
Just one more an observation on that. I mean, the other character out of this period of time, Wittgenstein, I would hate to think what he would have done if he had gotten Prozac. I mean, I think it would have profoundly diminished his output. But the question I want to ask is not so much about Freud and his philosophy and the underpinnings, the theoretical underpinnings, but the psychoanalytic process. I've been a psychoanalytic patient, and my observation about the process was that it was very spiritual in the final analysis. I mean, more akin to Buddhism than to a didactic or more conventional kind of therapy where there's a therapist giving you ideas and instruction. You know, this was a spiritual experience. And Mahler, to me, is the most spiritual of composers in my perception. So how would you draw parallels between the spirituality, which I'm not sure I can define for you, of the psychoanalytic process and Mahler's productivity? And how would you see spirituality as being connected with creativity in any way?
Mm-hmm. Let's take that, and then let's take the last question right there from the gentleman in back of you, and we'll take them both together. Go on. Please. Yeah, get to the mic.
Well, let's get to the Copenhagen event here. You alluded to a day spent with Mahler and Freud.
Right.
What transpired?
Okay, we'll get those two go nicely together. Who wants to take them? David, you want to start us?
Well, I think, yes, the whole issue of spirituality. Well, I would hope that to answer your part of your question, I would hope that most treatments are not giving instructions and nostrums and directives to patients, and that most treatments would allow something deeper within the person to be able to emerge within that person and between the two who are having the treatment. I think issues of spirituality vary from person to person, and that the impulse, that part of the spiritual experience is the impulse to be at one with something larger and to be able to feel something larger than oneself. And for some people this is extremely important, and for others this is less important. But surely for those who and I think many people at certain times, and particularly times of resolution, feel some sense of being part of a larger universe. I think part of our experience of listening to music is not only, or very much, the resonance that we experience with that I think it was James who said that here was someone who was going through what he has gone through, and so the feeling that one is not alone in the universe and that there are others that are like oneself, I think is very important. But I think another aspect of all of music's experience is the experience of being able to be part of a larger, to give oneself over to a larger experience, which is a kind of a spiritual experience. A patient once said to me, I don't believe in God, I believe in Mozart and Bach. And which I think captured that kind of sense of being part of a larger unit.
Well, and Mahler's own journey through the questions he poses, and I'm borrowing from something James said the other day, goes from the philosophers and from Nietzsche, and then goes to ultimately to Christian answers and Christian texts, to humanistic texts, and finally ends up in Eastern spirituality with Das Lied von der Erde.
And I think if he had lived another 2 decades, there would have been more. I don't believe he would have stopped at any point. I don't think he was capable of stopping. I don't think he wanted to stop.
And Michael, give us a 30-second summary of the Mahler-Freud confrontation.
It was a leisurely walk of about 2 hours on a summer afternoon, and there's a very nice account of it that Freud gave when he was asked to some years later by Theodor Reich, another analyst who was himself a very refined musician. Freud talks about that conversation and says that Mahler was in fact very sensitive to, you can add to this and correct me, very, very sensitive to the categories of psychoanalysis, and that he was very worried about his marriage, and that Freud was able to assure Mahler that Alma would not leave him. And one reason she would not leave him was that, in fact, he probably reminded her of her father, which may or may not have been flattering to Mahler.
Which must have helped their sex life a whole bunch, you know?
Well, in fact, it did. In fact, it did. If you'd like me to elaborate a little bit more on that encounter, in fact, it did. Mahler was desperate. He was in enormous despair because not only had he experienced several years before the loss of his daughter, which I think became a factor in Alma's disenchantment with him. He not only lost his daughter, he also lost his power, in part because he was diagnosed with heart disease. Alma found herself less and less in love with him, and when she went to a spa in Toblach, I believe it was, in August of 1910, no, it was in June and July of 1910, she met up with Walter Gropius, a tall, handsome Prussian Aryan, with whom she had an affair. And she came back, and Gropius had addressed a letter to her, presumably, but he really addressed it to Mahler, in which he described their affair and he wanted her to run away. And then Gropius came to visit them. Mahler and she and Alma had this out. The question is whether she would be with him or not. And Mahler became just desperate. He was desperate that she would leave him. He was 20 years older than she, as Michael had said, and he fell apart because he felt he needed her. And he would lie on the ground and cry, and she would find him, and he would go to her room and plead with her, and so on. And through a relation of Alma's, he was set up with Freud, who was then on vacation in Leiden, after establishing the International Psychoanalytic Association in Nuremberg. Anyway, Freud agreed to see him. They spent 4 hours together in Leiden, where Freud did, in fact, as Michael has said, reassure Mahler that he didn't think that Alma would leave him because he did, in fact, remind her of his father, and that further that Mahler had an attachment to Alma because she reminded him of his mother.
This is called help. You have to understand.
Well, in fact, it rejuvenated Mahler, and Alma subsequently said that Freud was right. It did cheer Mahler, and she didn't leave him. Gropius came back, and she didn't go with Gropius then. The tragedy, of course, is that, or one of the tragedies, there are a number of tragedies, but one of the tragedies is that in December of that year, Mahler got subacute bacterial endocarditis and died the following May in Vienna. He got subacute bacterial endocarditis here in New York and then went back and died. The whole issue of his fear of death, if there were, and the question of his mortality, if that was an issue, and I think there's a question, wasn't touched by Freud and Mahler at that time. But in fact, and as we will talk about, I think, Freud had really no feeling about what Mahler's music was about or what Mahler was about. He knew he was important, and he knew he was a rock star because he had been the head of the Vienna Opera. But Freud himself had very little feeling about music, but we'll talk about that more.
So as I tell you in the seminar, we're going to talk about great creativity. We're going to talk about great theories that Freud has. We're going to talk about great creation, and we are also going to talk about sex. So it's going to be a great seminar. I want to thank our panel very much for that. That was wonderful. Thank you, Alan. That's great. Yeah, it's wonderful.